This was another town that we went to, and they've done some reconstruction of that, but it was amazing to me how much was still left.
To get an idea of all this geography, because there's a lot of information, I wanted to give you a little bit of perspective of Israel. It's only about 140 miles from the top of Israel to the bottom of the Dead Sea. So it's a very small, which is about the same distance between here and Tampa. And you can imagine, we're going to talk a little bit about the geography. Well, it's called the bridge because of the fact that you've got Egypt, this major superpower, and some other superpowers that also were in Africa. And then you have Syria, you have Babylon, you have all these world powers. And whenever somebody was taking over, the Romans, they'd have to go take care of the Egyptians. And so there was every power in the ancient world and in much of the modern world possessed that land at one time or another because of just its location. And there were three major trade routes at that time. One coming from Rome, which we refer to the Roman road, which is basically any road the Romans made. And then the other was the Via Maris, I believe it was. It came, I think, down to Egypt. And then the King's Highway, which I think connected like with China and with the Far East. But basically, they came right through where Jesus lived. Not in his hometown, but came through the area where he probably did a lot of work with his father when they were doing the work that they were doing. And so he was exposed to all these different cultures and all these different religions coming in, and he knew about these things. And we're going to talk more, that even show more about that. Because in the north you have this lush green, cool lake water, fresh water, and it's very similar to Florida because it's lime rock. So what we're going to do is, we're not going to go in the exact order that we went on the trip, but we're going to start in the Dead Sea region and talk about the Jewish context of Jesus some. And that'll be a fairly short piece because we're wanting to really focus on the life and ministry of Jesus, because that was what our time was mostly spent on. So then we're going to move all the way up to where Jesus grew up. We'll go through Bethlehem on the way, and then we'll go Nazareth. Cana's just 6 miles away, and Zipporee, or however that's pronounced, Zipporee, I think is 7 miles away in a different area with that. And in Capernaum is where his headquarters were when he did his ministry. And then we're going to go to Jerusalem, which is really focused on the last week of his life. And then we're going to go to Caesarea Maritima, which is where Paul was in prison and appealed to Rome to go to Rome. And so you go from Pentecost to the launching of the early church and the kind of practical application of that. So in the Dead Sea area, you have the Ein Gedi, Dead Sea Scrolls that were found that are just a remarkable confirmation of the authenticity and the credibility of our scriptures. King David hid out in this area in the wilderness when he was hiding from Saul. And then John the Baptist, of course. And then, of course, Jesus was in the wilderness there. As the deer pants for the water. Well, this is really what the word is. Ibex. It looks a little different than our deer and what's there. So there's four things that you need whenever you have a civilization. You have to have water. You have to have agriculture if you're going to grow and eat. You have to have commerce, which is transportation. You have to have the ability for people to come and go and bring goods and stuff. And you have to have some sort of ability to protect yourself and have a defense and have safety with that. So down in the wilderness, this oasis is how David survived, and probably how John the Baptist survived, and how Jesus, he didn't go down there and drink any water, but how Jesus was in this area. It's filled with a lot of caves and things that are kind of built into them that are just part of the terrain. So we had a lot of fun at this location. Qumran community we looked at was an ascetic community, and that was all males, and it was very much of a community that was spiritually based, and they had these scrolls and hid these scrolls in the caves that were later found. It was in the Mary, you probably remember 1940s or 1946 when the kid threw a rock up into one of the caves and heard some pottery crack, and then they found these remarkable Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's a picture of just the Dead Sea Scrolls that's in the museum, and they preserved that for us. So this is where John the Baptizer lived here as an adult. And by the way, the Orthodox Church calls John the Forerunner. John the Forerunner. And David and his men hid from King Saul, and Jesus tempted here. So the wilderness always was tied to pursuing holiness and going else. Okay? And this was a picture from out in the area. So now we're going to go to the Galilee region.
Now the water has flowed down to the lake and gathered in the Sea of Galilee, which is really a lake. It's not an ocean. It's fresh water. And a beautiful space. We went, now, anytime there's water, there have been civilizations that have lived there. So there's been layers and layers of civilization. Wheat grows wild over there, like along the road and everywhere and everything. And so it was the wheat harvesting time. It was ready. And so they had whoever wanted to volunteer go thresh. She had a sickle, go thresh some wheat. And so it helped me visualize more the wheat and the chaff and the straw and all that kind of stuff, because we actually got to see it in context. And so that was a lot of fun. At the headwaters of the Jordan in the far north, it's just fresh, clear, beautiful water. Now, when we were there before, they said it was okay to drink. We went to a place where it was okay to drink. She didn't advise it this time, but also she's a nurse and the other guy's a theologian, and so there might have been a difference of opinion there as well. And then while we were there, we're in this was actually over toward the ocean, Mount Carmel, where we're looking over the Jezreel Valley. And so that's where they do a lot of farming, because there's water and everything, but the fertilizer and stuff from the from the fields then gets in the water. So we went to Capernaum, where was the site of Jesus did a lot of his ministry on the side of the lake. And so there they have excavated this house. It's the ruins, but you can see how it looks like concentric circles or shapes. So I'm not going to tell you all the details they found, but they found different things, were lists of names and that kind of thing, like of the apostles' names that were carved into the wall and things like that. So they say that this is Peter's house, Peter's mother-in-law's house at Capernaum or whatever, that's where they think it was. And that's where the church met. And so as the church grew, they had to build bigger walls, so they had more space to meet. Now, that is, when they found it, then the Catholic Church bought it and built a church over it. So that Bob found that as an old picture where you kind of get a picture of it before they built the church on top of it. So, and then right across the way, like as far as maybe from here to the back parking lot, is the synagogue. And the synagogue there, they have, you can see, and then go across the way and to the synagogue. So it was within walking distance. So they built it in the 1st century, and then over time it collapsed. And so in the 4th century they built it again, but they built it on top of the same. They used the foundation that was already there, if it's still there. So you can see the line from the old 1st century temple and then the 4th century temple on top of it. So that was pretty cool. And this was another town that we went to, and they've done some reconstruction of that, but it was amazing to me how much was still left. The way they do it, they'll make a line of the reconstruction line so you know where this was all the original, but then they use the rocks that have fallen down, and they just rebuild the structures on top of that. This town, it's called Sephoria, or with an S, Sephoria, Sephoria, are two different, towns have lots of different names in different languages and over time. So this is a town right outside of Nazareth, about 7 miles away, and I learned about it in my New Testament class right before we went over there, and then we went and visited it. Because they've done, Sephoria, they worked with the Roman government a little bit more than some towns. In the revolt, they did not join the revolt. So Rome liked them and gave them special privileges because they cooperated with them. So it was kind of a thriving town. A lot of building going on. They suspect that, there's no evidence that you could find of it, but they suspect that if Joseph and Jesus, as a young boy, were looking for work, they might have walked 7 miles to go work at Sephoria. And so I learned about that in my class, and then we went there. So it was a thriving community. So this is a Roman road that they excavated there in Sephoria that runs from Sephoria up. It was pointed to Nazareth and then south down to Samaria. And so you can see the grooves from the chariots in the road. So, and it's right in Sephoria, there's a crossroads. So there's this is the crossroads, one running north-south and one running east-west. So it was a busy place. And back in the background, that's Nazareth back there, which is a big town now, but in Jesus' day was quite a small town. One of the things that they did is they had a water system. They had a water collection system that brought the water they would collect it from the springs and then guide it 2 miles and filter out, and all that kind of stuff. And so we got to go, they've excavated that, and we got to walk down in that so that they could get water there. They had lots of mosaics in the floors there that they fixed up. And at first they thought this must have been a huge home or a public building with all these different mosaics. But now the current thinking is they think it was like the showroom. Like if you wanted to, like now you might have a salesman come and bring you a book that shows the different patterns of mosaics. Well, they didn't have that, so they just built this place, and so you could come here and look at all these different designs of mosaics and pick which one you wanted in your floor. So that's what they tend to think it really was. That Jesus was described as being a tecton. That's what I learned in my class. And that a tecton is someone who works with natural materials, which could be pottery, wood, tile, stone, mason, bricks, that kind of thing. And so in Israel, they don't have very many trees except olive trees. And they don't really build that much out of wood. They do build some things out of wood, tables and whatnot, but a lot of it's made out of stone. And so the thinking is Jesus was probably a stonemason too. He had those skills. He worked with his hands to make things out of the materials that are available. This is the sanctuary of Pan, and that's an author's rendition of what it might have looked like in its heyday way back in the Canaanite period or whatever. And then that's what it looks like today, the ruins that they've excavated.
The reason that's so profound for me is when Michael was talking about the gates of hell, and Jesus there, I didn't realize how expansive and how pagan and how lost this area was, which was sort of descended from Dan, the tribe of Dan, and how the faith had become so distorted. But in this area here is really the key, which I have the arrow pointing up there. That's what it looks like. Is water would come flowing out of there, and they would sacrifice people in this place, and the blood would go down in the water, and then they would if it didn't have, they couldn't see any blood and water, they sacrifice somebody else to make sure that they're pleasing their God. I mean, you think of the contrast of that. But it was a long line of all these different groups. Temple of Pan, of Pan and the nymphs, of Zeus, of Nemesis, of sacred goats, all this kind of row of these pagan temples, and that Jesus and the disciples went up in there, and that they were looking at these things and probably just gut-wrenching to think about what was going on there. And this is where he's looking at this and he says, and the gates of hell will not stand against what you said, Peter, in his proclamation. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And upon this rock I'm going to build my church. It just really affected me to just think about, the humanity and of that experience, and the offense to God, the fully God part of Jesus, the offense of what was going on there and what had been going on there, and his confronting that.
So then further up the hill, this is in this same region in the northern part of Israel, is Tel Dan. Tel is like an archaeological area where they excavate the town. There's a gate there, and gates were where the elders would sit, or the kings or the judges would sit and rule, and you'll say, and at the city gate, you'll read that in the Bible. So this is one older gate that they excavated, and then there's another gate like that's a little farther on, not too far, like they expanded it or something when it was bigger. And then this seat, they think it comes from 2 Samuel, where it says the king would take his seat at the gate. And so since that looked like a special separate place where a person of honor would sit. When you first go to an area, if you look, or when you're doing excavations, the size of the rocks matter. Because probably when you're building first, you're going to use the biggest rocks. And you're in that kind of thing, you're going to have the biggest rocks at the bottom. And then they crumble and fall or whatever, and you still use them, but they're smaller because they're broken, and you square them up again and build them again. And so you can see these are pretty big. It's hard to tell, but these are pretty big rocks here, and these are a little bit smaller rocks. So expecting that this is the older gate when it was smaller, and then they expanded it out there. Then up at the very top, they had a Jewish temple and a pagan temple, and the mixing of the cultures, and that was did not please God. Then somewhere in between, where the gates of hell and this mount at the top of the city was the Abraham's gate, which is from they filled it in. They found it and then they filled it in to support the arch and everything that are still there. And they estimated that it's from 1700 BC, from that era. Then we went to Magdala, Mary Magdalene, from the area where she was from. And this area is really focused on women and supporting women and the role that they play in Christian ministry growing. And so they started, the Catholic Church, I think, bought this property and were building a resort. And then they found stuff, just what you finally do when you start digging anywhere there, you're going to find stuff. So they uncovered this synagogue from the 1st century. And it's just amazing that things were still intact in the place. And one thing in particular, the tile work, you can see, and there were some tiles, I don't have a picture of it on here, they had some unusual rare colors, like yellow colors and peachy color that was kind of unusual that they would find that to be able to dye that color. And that stone in the middle was real unique. They said that's the only one that they found. And it has different impressions on each of the 4 sides and then on the top. And they think that was where they would lay the scrolls to read, because on each side there's kind of a little notch like you might wear at wrist. at the Separita, there was a thing that they talked about. They refurbish the mosaic tiles in different ways. And sometimes when they're doing that, they leave them where they are. And so you see, the earth has changed over the centuries, but they leave it there and restore them. And then there was another place at Separita where they removed them carefully. Anyway, they removed them and then took them to a facility that was temperature controlled and all that kind of stuff, and preserved them there, and then stabilized them, I guess, on wood or something. And there were houses there and nicholas and all sorts of things. And but it was a beautiful chapel inside there, and they had beautiful mosaics on the wall.
So the living waters is a really important concept in our faith, and the fact that we're baptized in living waters, meaning that it's not stagnant and it's not dead with that. And so the closer you are to the source, the cleaner and clearer and everything is. So this is just right out on the southern side of the lake, Sea of Galilee. And so it's at the top of it, and as it goes farther and farther and farther south, it gets more and more fertilizer and pollutions, it gets smaller, and so this is actually the Jordan River right across there in that bottom right as well. There were a number of people that we reaffirmed their baptism. It wasn't a second baptism, and I kept messing up the words, but God knew that I was not that it's two expressions of the same baptism. Okay, it's one baptism. So then we went out on the lake, and that experience, and had the crew here. And in the back, you see Golan Heights and some of these other things that we're going to talk about in just a minute. So that was a lot of fun. And so we actually crossed the lake went to the other side, which is in the area where the Gerasene demoniac was when Jesus got out and came running down the area. And right above that area, all these caves in there, they were finding where they're burying people. And their religion, they didn't bury them underground. They put them in there, and the animals and whatever, and would take them. And you remember that he was up among the tombs, and he came running down, screaming at Jesus with that. But one of the most amazing things, again, it's every time you go to Israel, I think it's like the first time you're going to Israel or something. I didn't realize this. Capernaum, where Jesus' headquarters was just at this end of the water. Right there is a major metropolitan Roman town, one of the Decapolis, which means 10 towns that were around. And so we came around, we're driving past these tombs, and went up to this area, which was one of these 10 towns in that area. This is an aerial. So we went up in there and just walked around it and just thought, I always think of Jesus as being kind of a farm boy, with sheep and with wheat and all these things. He was familiar with farming. He referred to it a lot in his parables and stuff. But he's living on this international trade route. He's got this major metropolitan, and he's city that's up there on the top of the hill. There's actually a double city, Susa, I think's the other, and he's over going in the area, and he is Jesus. And so that was one of the really remarkable things that struck me, is that he was very familiar with urban metropolitan life. So this is a picture of what that probably looked like when they were there, because Rome was everywhere and they were building everything. and that's a reconstructed road. And then you're looking right over at, I think, Tiberias over there, and then Capernaum is just a little north of that. And so they're right there from each other. And you could go and spend 10 days in Jerusalem, and one of the difficulties is the fact that they have built churches on top of all these different places, and so that's nice, and you can really see some neat stuff there, and they're probably accurate. But the interesting thing to me is, for thousands of years or so, this wall was ground. It was a hill that came down, and they had to excavate it and get down to where they got to see this wall, the Western Wall. And then we're going to talk a little bit and see about this little bridge that they had that was the entranceway into the Temple Mount. The Temple Holy of Holies is up there with the little white building at the top. And that's where the Mosque of the Dome was built, right on top of where the Holy of Holies was, which didn't make many people very happy. And then there's that little building there on the side that we're talking about. These sheep were actually by the side of the road while we're driving down in the bus. And he was the shepherd, and they're ugly and they're dirty and they stink, and they really are nothing at all like you think of sheep. So this is a picture of where we stayed in Christ Church, is that building there. And then that's the guest house, and the gate that you come into it, which is where they're standing right here. That's why I kind of made that arrow up to it. Is right across from the David's Tower area with that. Now this was all, the David's Tower, the basis of it was Herod's palace. And so, again, these things, a lot of it are underground and you can't see it. Well, where the guest house is that we stayed, about 45 feet below it are the gardens on Herod's palace. The other thing that I learned, which was really interesting to me, is that I always thought when he went to Pilate's house and he went to Herod's house and then he went back to Pilate's house. Well, it's all the same place. It's all in the same major area there. It's just they had the administrative offices down there that he went to see Pilate. And then this is our deaf group with the old city in the background.
Question.
Yeah.
Are those camels?
They are camels, yeah. I sort of looked right past it. They were on the other side of the road. We had the sheep here, and look, there's camels up there. And so, they're just doing what camels do, eating rocks. I don't know, but that was fun.
The property that this is near is the Catholic Church of St. Anne, A-N-N-E. In the scripture, this is right outside. This is primarily in a Palestinian area now of section of the old city, but that St. Anne's Church is there, and it's right inside what is called the Lion Gate. Like outside there's lions, but it was also called the sheep gate, like they might have brought the sheep in. And so if you read that story in the Bible, it says, and just inside the sheep gate there was a pool that had 5 columns. And so you can see some of the columns, not columns, arches, 5 arches. And so you can see some of the arches. So I think a lot of this is fairly new, and they're still excavating, as you could see. So it was pretty fascinating to put those connections together. This is the Dome of the Rock that was built on top of where they think the Holies of Holies was, based on their excavations. And so that's all Muslim, and is a mosque, and you can't go inside it. And then, but you can just see the tile work is amazing, but they won't. It's always either writing or geometric shapes or whatever. They don't want any kind of human figures or anything like that.
You don't go inside the Dome of the Rock?
No, you can't.
No, but what were those people like?
That's a little outside building. Oh, it's the wrong way. Did I go too far? That's a little building outside, this one. So we could go in that one, but then not in that. Yeah. So then there's the Western Wall, and they divide. The men pray on one side and the women pray on the other. And that is likely because so that women can feel free to pray and not be encumbered by, can feel freely pray. So it wasn't meant as a put down or whatever. But anyway, and you can tuck your prayers in there, but like you said, it was just, it was a deep, they had to excavate it to get down to it. So the temple was built on a mount, the Temple Mount, the mountain, okay, and then there was another mountain over here, and that's where the town was. And so to get to the temple, you had to go down the valley and back up. Well, they decided at some point to build a bridge, because then we don't have to go all the way down the valley and all the way back up. We'll just build this bridge. And so this is a fairly new exhibit area that they've opened up when they excavated. So when they were finding it, they saw, oh, these are the arches. Oh, this is the bridge. The Great Bridge is what they call it. And then later they found this room, this building attached to it. They were like, well, what is this? Was this the well house or whatever? And whatever. So in all the excavation, you get down to, so I'm going to show you some pictures, but there's a section of the Western Wall that's highlighted there that is like, so it's a different section than what you're going to here. So there's a section down underneath that we went to that's also a section of the Western Wall. And so not as close, I think the other one is closer to the Holy of Holies, would be over here, closer to the Holy Holies, but still this is a section of the Western Wall that we got to see. So this picture, I tried to take a picture of, you can see the arch down here, and then up above the other arch. So we started up there and then came down. So you can see the double arches just like they had in the bridge. And then that building, from what they've done in the reconstruction, is they think somehow there was water that came in and flowed through, and they made these spouts, and it come down to this pool and everything. And so it was really quite elaborate. And we have some pictures of that, but they're not on here. So that building is this little side building over here is what that looked like. And then this is just a big arched room that is one of these arches, the big arches. So anyway. And then on the southern steps, the southern side of the Temple Mount is where Pentecost happened. Right. When the Peter's sermon and that kind of thing. And so that's the southern wall. And along that area, there are lots of mikvahs that they would have done the ceremonial cleansing before they went into the temple. But then after Peter's sermon, when so many people were saved, and they said, well, let's get baptized. And there were all these mikvahs readily available. Caesarea is back on the Mediterranean Sea, Caesarea Maritima, and Herod built it up huge. Okay, he was quite the engineer as far as him making it a port so that lots of commerce could come in there and all that sort of stuff. So in its heyday, it was a huge place. And this huge amphitheater, they've rebuilt it, but the foundation of it was already there. And they use it for modern things, as you can see, to have concerts and that kind of thing. But on that stage, if you read in the Bible, that's on that stage where Herod Agrippa was.
Well, he took sick, and he actually died like 2 to 5 days later. But in the scripture, it describes it, and it said he had worms, and that God was punishing and killing him because they had him. He was adorned. This was his spot, and he was on stage. And they put on a costume of him, and we're seeing him as God, and worshiping him. And then he died.
That was a recreation of what in its heyday, what it might have looked like with all the things. But there is so they've just, since we were there last time, 3 years ago, they've started doing some excavations because a lot of people, tourists weren't there. And so this is like the newly excavated area where they think was the prisons. And so that's probably where Paul could have been held when he was in prison there. And so from Paul started his missionary journeys from Caesarea Maritima, but he also left from Caesarea Maritima as a prisoner and then went to Rome, where he died. So they're saying, thank you, thank you, thank you, love you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Bye-bye, thank you. All right.
So Kathy, what's this?
That's I love you.
Oh.
I love you. I love you.